At 07:42 a.m., over the snow-dusted fields of Italy, the roar of an engine sliced through the still air, rattling loose pebbles across the trench lines. Lieutenant James Walker gripped the controls of his B-24 Liberator, the M2.50 caliber Browning mounted at the nose of the aircraft, vibrating in time with the hum of the engines. Through the thin windshield he saw the black tracers from German flak guns zip past, the anti-aircraft shells bursting with violent flashes, but they couldn't touch him. Not with the 50 cal. The weight of the weapon, steady in his hands, was a comfort. He had seen it tear through Luftwaffe fighters and the thickest armor of panzer tanks. An indiscriminate machine of destruction. "Come on, baby," he muttered, his fingers tightening around the trigger. A German Me-109 screamed from his left, but before it could adjust its line of attack, the M2 let loose. A burst that shook the air like thunder, sending the enemy plane into a spiraling dive. Down it went. Another kill. But the battle was far from over, and Walker knew this weapon, this deadly 50 cal, was not just feared, it was inevitable. At 09:03 a.m., February 22nd, 1941, a crisp morning on a makeshift airfield in Tunisia, Sergeant Bill Turner watched the first M2 50 caliber machine gun being fitted to a rugged B-17 bomber. The metal gleamed under the North African sun, its barrel still cold from the morning air. Turner had heard stories from the mechanics who'd worked with the weapon stateside, tales of its devastating power and mechanical reliability. "It's gonna rattle your bones, but she'll cut a path through anything in her way," the armourer muttered as Turner inspected the new addition. His hands moved over the receiver, feeling the weight of 60 pounds of machined steel and precision engineering. Turner had spent months on the ground, hearing whispers from other mechanics about the M2's power, its relentless precision. The weapon had been designed by John Browning decades earlier, refined through countless iterations until it became something more than a machine gun. It was a force multiplier. "Just a heavy thing," he mused, running his fingers over the cold steel, but he knew better. The specifications told the real story. 50 caliber rounds, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, could penetrate up to 2 inches of steel plate at close range. The cyclic rate of 450 to 600 rounds per minute meant that anything caught in its path would be shredded. The M2's presence was massive. Turner traced the barrel's length, noting the quick change capability that would allow gunners to swap out overheated barrels in combat. The recoil system, a marvel of engineering, absorbed much of the weapon's tremendous kickback. "Let's see what it can do," Turner said, wiping his hands on his pants. The armourer nodded and began loading the ammunition belt, each brass cartridge clinking against the next. Turner stepped back and watched as the first test burst echoed across the airfield. Sand kicked up in clouds. The sound was like nothing else, a deep, thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very air. At 11:50 a.m., over New Guinea, Corporal Jack Mitchell was doing the daily checks on the M250 cal mounted on his jeep. The tropical heat was oppressive, turning the metals scorching to the touch. He worked carefully, using a rag to handle the weapon's components. The air smelled of salt water and rotting vegetation, and the sun beat down like a hammer. Sweat ran down his neck as he moved with precision, inspecting each joint and screw on the weapon. The M2 had been mounted on an improvised pedestal, welded directly to the Jeep's frame, a field modification that had become standard practice. His crew was preparing for another recon mission into enemy-held territory. The Japanese were relentless, probing American positions daily, and each patrol brought the possibility of ambush. But Mitchell's M2 had proven itself. Intelligence reports documented how a single burst could disable a truck, suppress a machine gun position, or force enemy infantry to ground. Mitchell checked the headspace and timing, crucial adjustments that ensured the weapon wouldn't jam or explode under fire. He worked the charging handle, feeling the smooth mechanical action. The ammunition belts lay coiled nearby, each belt holding 100 rounds of devastating firepower. But today, it wasn't just routine. He could feel it in his gut, see it in the faces of his squadmates. The crew was uneasy. The reports coming from other units were dire. They weren't just facing enemy soldiers, they were facing something more, an enemy equipped with weaponry that could outgun them at every turn. "You ready, Mitchell?" The voice of his commander, Lieutenant Barnes, cracked through his thoughts. Barnes stood near the jeep, studying a map marked with red circles indicating known enemy positions. Mitchell gave a tight nod, testing the trigger mechanism once more. The M2 hummed to life under his hands, the bolt cycling smoothly. He loaded a fresh belt, watching as the rounds fed properly through the mechanism. Everything was working perfectly, but that did little to ease the knot in his stomach. At 04:21 p.m, the sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon as Mitchell's jeep rolled into enemy territory. The jungle pressed in from both sides, thick and suffocating. The M2 was strapped tightly to its mount, barrel pointed forward, ready for whatever emerged from the dense foliage. The enemy was closing in, and the jungle seemed alive with the weight of anticipation. Mitchell's pulse quickened as the vegetation thinned ahead. He could hear something, the distant growl of engines, the metallic clink of equipment. His hands found the M2's grips, thumbs resting on the butterfly trigger. Barnes raised his fist, signaling the squad to halt. The jeep idled quietly as everyone strained to listen. Then they saw it, a Japanese supply convoy, 3 trucks moving, slowly along a dirt road 50 yards ahead. The lead vehicle was packed with soldiers. "Fire!" The order came, sharp and clear. Without hesitation, Mitchell squeezed the trigger. The M2 roared to life, its recoil jarring his entire body despite the mount. The muzzle flash was blinding in the fading light. He saw the first of the enemy vehicles, the lead truck, shudder as heavy rounds tore through its engine block. Steam erupted from the radiator. Then the fuel tank caught, and the truck exploded in a burst of orange flame and black smoke. The heavy rounds tore through the truck like it was paper. Mitchell adjusted his aim, walking fire across the convoy. The second truck tried to reverse, but stalled. Soldiers were jumping from the vehicles, scrambling for cover. Mitchell kept firing in controlled bursts, exactly as he'd been trained. His squad cheered as enemy soldiers retreated into the jungle. The M2 had shown them the power they could wield. Brass casings littered the jeep's floor, still hot and smoking. But as the dust settled and Mitchell released the trigger, breathing hard, he knew it wasn't over. The jungle was full of Japanese forces. They'd just announced their position to everyone within miles. More were coming. At 02:13 p.m, over North Africa, Sergeant Turner found himself racing to keep pace with the bomber stream. The B-17 had been in the air for over 5 hours, droning steadily toward enemy territory. The formation was tight, each aircraft maintaining precise spacing to maximize defensive firepower. The heavy hum of the M250 Cal, in the tailgun position, filled the air as gunners worked it with mechanical precision. Turner had transitioned from mechanic to aerial gunner, and he'd seen firsthand what the weapon could do. It didn't just stop enemy fighters, it shredded their wings, punctured fuel tanks and sent them plummeting earthward trailing smoke. The tail gunner, Sergeant McKinney, sat hunched in his position, scanning the sky through plexiglass. The oxygen mask covered his face, his breath fogging rhythmically. The temperature at 25,000 feet was 40 degrees below zero. Ice crystals formed on the inside of the turret, but today The threat was different. Intelligence reports had warned them. A German Me-262, one of the first jet-powered fighters, had been spotted in the area. The new aircraft could reach speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, faster than anything the Allies had encountered. Turner cursed under his breath as he manned the waist gun. They weren't prepared for this. The M2 was designed to engage conventional fighters that attacked at predictable speeds and angles, but a jet? That changed everything. The formation radio crackled. "Bogey, 6 o'clock high." McKinney's voice cut through. "Coming in fast." Turner caught a glimpse through the waist window, a sleek, swept-wing shape diving toward them at incredible speed. The Me-262's cannons sparkled as it opened fire. Tracers streaked past. "Hold steady," Turner shouted, though his voice barely carried over the engine noise. His hands gripped the M2, tracking the jet as it screamed past. He fired, a long burst that arced into empty sky. The jet was already gone, climbing away faster than his eyes could follow. It would take all of their skill and the M2's precision to survive encounters with this new threat. The rules had changed. At 03:07 p.m., Turner's worst fear was realized. The Me-262 made another pass, this time approaching from the sun. Its speed was devastating. The German pilot understood his advantage. He could choose his angle, strike, and disengage before the bomber's gunners could track him. The jet broke through their defensive envelope, its 30mm cannons hammering the formation. Turner watched in horror as an explosion rippled through the sky. His wingman, a B-17 flying 50 yards to starboard, took hits in the No. 3 engine. Fire bloomed orange against the blue sky. "Fire the M2! Fire the M2!" Captain Richards screamed over the intercom. The panic in his voice was unmistakable, rare for a veteran pilot with 30 missions completed. Turner's hands moved instinctively, squeezing the butterfly trigger. The M2 screamed back into life, vibrating violently as it cycled through rounds. He aimed where the jet would be, not where it was. Led the target, but the Me-262 was already accelerating away, its superior speed carrying it out of range in seconds. A moment too late, always a moment too late against that thing. The squadron pulled into evasive maneuvers, each pilot breaking formation slightly to make themselves harder targets. But Turner's gut twisted as he watched the stricken B-17 lose altitude. 3 parachutes blossomed, only 3 from a crew of 10. The bomber spiraled down, trailing black smoke. The M2 had been their shield against Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Against Me-109s and FW-190s, the weapon was effective, devastating even. But this new threat operated under different physics. The jet's speed negated much of what made the M2 dominant. Turner kept his eyes on the sky, watching for the next attack. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the recoil and the bitter cold. He could hear McKinney breathing heavily in the tail position, still scanning, still ready. The Me-262 didn't return. Perhaps it had expended its ammunition. Perhaps the pilot decided the risk wasn't worth another pass, but everyone knew this wasn't over. The Germans were deploying more jets every week. The war was evolving faster than anyone had anticipated. At 11:12 a.m. over Sicily, a mechanic by the name of Harold Finch stood in front of the M2 .50 Cal, sweating in the Mediterranean heat. The airfield was a converted olive grove, the ground still scarred from recent shelling. His task was urgent. A directive had come down from higher command. The gun had been performing flawlessly in most engagements, but intelligence reports were troubling. The Germans were adapting. Their armoured vehicles now featured improved plating. Their aircraft incorporated heavier protection around critical components. The Luftwaffe was learning to survive M2 fire, Finch knew this wasn't just about routine maintenance anymore. It was about evolution, about keeping pace with an enemy that refused to stand still. The M2 had to change, even if only incrementally. He worked methodically, adjusting the gas regulator to optimize the weapon's cyclic rate. A slight modification to the buffer spring changed the recoil characteristics, allowing for more sustained fire without overheating. He examined the barrel, noting the wear patterns, and consulted technical bulletins that had arrived from Aberdeen Proving Ground. Every small change was an effort to maintain the M2's edge. Finch tweaked the backplate assembly, ensuring smoother extraction of spent casings. He tested different ammunition loads: standard ball, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds in various combinations. Each belt configuration served a different tactical purpose. His fingers worked fast, the familiar tools comforting in his hands. He'd been a machinist before the war, working in a Detroit factory that now produced aircraft engines. Those skills translated directly to keeping weapons functioning under impossible conditions. The stakes couldn't be higher. If they didn't adapt, if the M2 couldn't keep up with German improvements, American crews would pay the price in blood. Finch had seen too many shot-up aircraft limp back to base, their gunners wounded or dead because their weapons hadn't been enough. He reassembled the M2, running function checks. The bolts cycled smoothly. The timing was perfect. He loaded a test belt and fired a short burst downrange, watching the impact pattern on a makeshift target. Tight grouping. Consistent. Good. Finch made notes in his maintenance log, documenting every adjustment. Other mechanics would need to replicate these modifications across the entire squadron. At 10:05 p.m., November 18, 1942, Mitchell's Jeep was at the front lines again, positioned on a ridge overlooking a contested valley. This time he wasn't just a vehicle gunner, he was a soldier fighting for survival. His unit had endured 3 weeks of continuous combat, and exhaustion showed in every face. The M2 had evolved since those early days in New Guinea. The modifications Finch and mechanics like him had implemented were paying dividends. The weapon's fire was more consistent, its reliability improved. Field armourers had solved many of the jamming issues that plagued earlier models. Mitchell's target tonight was clear: an enemy armoured column advancing through the valley below. Intelligence estimated 4 tanks, multiple trucks, and at least a company of infantry. The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned, but they held the high ground. "Mitchell, you're up," Lieutenant Barnes shouted from the command post. "When that lead tank reaches the marker, give them hell." Mitchell nodded, his hands finding the familiar grips of the M2. The weapon was loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds, not enough to destroy a tank outright, but sufficient to damage optics, disable weapons, and terrorize crews. The column advanced slowly, cautiously. The lead tank was a Panzer IV, its long 75mm gun scanning for threats. Mitchell waited, controlling his breathing. Patience. Timing was everything. The tank reached the designated position, a destroyed farmhouse that served as their range marker. Mitchell fired. The M2 cracked to life, sending a stream of heavy bullets into the tank. Sparks flew as rounds ricocheted off armor, but some found purchase. He aimed for the vision ports, the commander's cupola, the engine deck. The tank rocked as several incendiary rounds ignited fuel residue on its exterior. The tank crew reacted, beginning to reverse, but Mitchell kept firing. The rest of his squad opened up with rifles and machine guns. Explosions erupted along the column as concealed mines detonated. The valley became a killing ground. The column scattered, vehicles reversing frantically, infantry diving for cover. Victory, hard-earned, purchased with superior position and the relentless firepower that men like Turner and Finch had worked to perfect. At 07:22 p.m., An air raid siren echoed through the bunkers at the base. The wailing tones sent everyone scrambling. A German airstrike was incoming. Reconnaissance had spotted a formation of Ju-88 bombers, escorted by fighters, heading directly toward their position. Mitchell sprinted to his jeep, where the M2 stood ready. Other crews manned anti-aircraft positions around the perimeter. The sky was darkening, stars beginning to emerge, which would make visual tracking difficult. The battle had evolved beyond simple infantry engagements. This was total war, a conflict where engineering, logistics, and adaptation determined survival. Every weapon, every vehicle, every fortification was part of an intricate system designed to kill efficiently. Mitchell braced himself as the first aircraft appeared on the horizon. The M2's roar would be the last thing some enemy airmen heard. He elevated the barrel, estimating altitude and lead. Anti-aircraft fire was as much art as science, requiring intuition built from experience. The Ju-88s approached in formation, their twin engines droning ominously. Mitchell opened fire, joining dozens of other weapons in a coordinated barrage. Tracers arced across the darkening sky, creating a lethal web of fire. The M2's distinctive sound, deeper, more authoritative than smaller caliber weapons, cut through the chaos. One bomber took hits, smoke trailing from an engine. It broke formation, losing altitude. Mitchell tracked it, firing again. More hits. The bomber's wings separated, and it plummeted earthward. No parachutes emerged, but the remaining bombers pressed on, releasing their payloads. Bombs whistled down, and Mitchell threw himself through, flat as explosions walked across the airfield. Earth and debris rained down. The concussion waves were crushing, driving the air from his lungs. When silence returned, Mitchell lifted his head. The M2 still stood intact on its mount, though the jeep had taken shrapnel. Around the perimeter, crews were checking their weapons, preparing for the next wave. The battle was no longer just about soldiers versus soldiers, tanks versus tanks. It was a war of systems, of production capacity, of relentless technological improvement. Adapt or perish, that was the only rule that mattered. This was their moment, and the M2's deadly hum remained their promise of survival. At 04:10 p.m., during a raid over Germany, Turner's B-17 was struck by enemy fire. The mission was a daylight bombing run against an industrial target deep in German territory, the kind of mission that tested every man and machine to their limits. Flak bursts filled the sky, black puffs of shrapnel and explosive force. The formation shuddered as shells detonated nearby. Turner manned the M2 in the nose gun position, scanning for fighters. The weapon was still firing, tracking a FW-190 that had made the mistake of attacking head-on. Then the hit came, a direct strike to the number 2 engine. The B-17 lurched violently, metal screamed, oil sprayed across the windscreen in dark streaks. "We've lost power," Captain Richards shouted over the intercom. His voice was strained but controlled. "Turner, keep those fighters off us." Turner could feel the cold steel under his hands as he fought to maintain his aim. The M2 bucked and roared, sending tracers toward an approaching Me-109. But something was wrong. The weapon's rate of fire slowed, then stopped entirely. The bolt was frozen in place. His heart sank. The M2 had jammed. The worst possible moment. Without nose armament, they were vulnerable to frontal attacks, which German pilots had learned to exploit. Come on," Turner muttered, his fingers working frantically. He pulled the charging handle back with all his strength. Stuck. He checked the feed mechanism. A spent casing had failed to extract properly, blocking the chamber. The metal was still hot, burning through his gloves. Turner worked quickly despite the pain, adrenaline sharpening his focus. He used a cleaning rod to drive the stuck casing out, burning his hands on the superheated metal. The seconds felt like hours as the Me-109 closed the distance. Finally, the obstruction cleared. The M2 roared back to life and Turner fired immediately. The burst caught the Me-109 as it pressed its attack, rounds walking up from the propeller to the cockpit. The German fighter rolled inverted and dove away, trailing smoke. But it was too late to prevent the damage. The B-17 was mortally wounded, losing altitude steadily. They had to make it back, somehow. At 6 a.m. the following morning, the B-17 made an emergency landing at a forward airfield in liberated France. The bombers barely touched down hard on grass, the damaged landing gear having failed to fully deploy. Metal scraped and sparked as the aircraft skidded to a halt. Turner sat in the nose compartment, breathing hard. Sweat and blood mixed on his brow. He'd suffered cuts from shrapnel during the engagement. Around him, the plexiglass was shattered, the metal framework bent. The M2 that had saved their lives sat silent now, its barrel still warm. Emergency crews rushed to the aircraft, pulling hatches open and helping the crew evacuate. 7 men emerged from the B-17. 3 had been wounded, 1 seriously, but they were alive. Against the odds, they'd survived. Captain Richards stood beside the damaged bomber, staring at the holes punched through the fuselage, over 80 flak hits by his count. The starboard wing showed massive damage, fabric torn away to reveal internal structures. It was a miracle the aircraft had held together. Turner walked on unsteady legs to where the captain stood. Neither man spoke for a moment, just looking at the wreckage that had carried them home. "The gun jammed," Turner finally said. "Should have checked it more carefully before the mission." Richards shook his head. "You cleared it and got it running again. That's what matters. That Me-109 would have killed us all." But Turner wasn't consoled. The M2's reliability had saved countless lives throughout the war, and this single failure, this one mechanical fault at the crucial moment, had nearly doomed them. It was a reminder that even the best weapons were machines, subject to wear, heat, fouling, and simple bad luck. "Next time," Turner whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "we make sure it works right. Every time. No exceptions." The sun was rising over the French countryside, painting the sky orange and gold. The bomber would never fly again. It would be stripped for parts. Its service ended on this muddy field. But the crew would fly again, in another aircraft, with another M2. The war demanded nothing less than complete commitment. At 02 LPM, 3 days later, as Turner watched the sunset from the base, he reflected on the men who had worked tirelessly to make the M2 what it was. Mechanics like Finch, armourers whose names he'd never know, engineers at factories across America who'd refined every component. The airfield was quiet now, between missions. Aircraft sat in orderly rows, their guns cleaned and ready. Ground crews worked methodically, performing maintenance with religious devotion. Every bolt, every spring, every feed mechanism was inspected and perfected. Turner had survived because of that dedication. The M2 had jammed, yes, but he'd been trained to clear malfunctions. The weapon's design, despite that single failure, had proven robust enough to restart under the worst possible conditions. That was engineering, building in redundancy, making systems that could fail and still be recovered. The weapon had become more than just a machine gun. It was a symbol of something larger, of industrial might, of American ingenuity, of the collective effort of thousands working toward victory. Every M2 represented hours of labor in factories, days of testing at proving grounds, weeks of training for gunners and mechanics. Turner thought about the battles he'd witnessed. He'd seen the M2 tear apart enemy fighters, suppress ground positions, defend bombers against impossible odds. He'd watched it fail once and learned from that failure. The weapon was powerful, but it required human skill to reach its potential. It had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of ingenuity, of survival, of the determination to win. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and purple, Turner knew they had turned the tide, not just because of the M2, but because they had adapted, evolved, and survived. The Germans were retreating on all fronts now. The war would continue for months yet, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. American production, American technology, and American determination had proven unstoppable. Turner touched the St. Christopher medal hanging around his neck, a gift from his mother before deployment. He whispered a prayer for the men still fighting, still dying. The war wasn't over, but they would win. Of that, he was certain. At 10 a.m. on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Turner stood in a base in England as the announcement came through. VE Day, victory in Europe. The fighting on this continent was finally over. Men cheered, embraced, wept openly. The weight of years of combat lifted, if only partially. The M250 caliber machine gun had earned its reputation throughout the conflict. Production records showed that over 2 million rounds had been manufactured, equipping everything from bombers to fighters to ground vehicles. The weapon had proved adaptable, reliable, and devastatingly effective. But the war's end brought reflection rather than celebration for many veterans. Turner thought about the men who hadn't made it home, the gunners who'd died at their weapons, the pilots who'd gone down over enemy territory, the mechanics killed in air raids on forward bases. Years later, Turner visited the National Museum of the United States Air Force. He walked slowly through exhibits documenting the air war, studying artifacts behind glass. And there it was, an M250 caliber machine gun, mounted exactly as he remembered it. The weapon that had saved his life now sat as a quiet relic of history. He stood before it for a long time, remembering the weight in his hands, the violent recoil, the distinctive sound that had meant survival. Other visitors walked past, glancing briefly at the display before moving on. They couldn't know what that weapon meant to those who'd depended on it. It wasn't just the gun, Turner whispered to no one in particular, his voice hoarse with age and emotion. It was us, all of us. The M2 had been a tool, steel and springs, and precise mechanical action. But its effectiveness came from the men who maintained it, aimed it, and fought with it. From the factory workers who'd built it to exacting standards. From the engineers who'd designed its elegant simplicity. From the logisticians who'd ensured it reached the front lines. The weapon's legacy would continue long after Turner's generation was gone. But he hoped people would remember it wasn't the gun alone that won the war. It was the people. At 05:30 p.m. that same evening, Turner sat in his hotel room and wrote a letter to his grandson, who'd asked about the war for a school project. The young man wanted to know about the weapons, the battles, the experience of combat. Turner had avoided these conversations for decades, but now felt compelled to answer. He reflected on the journey of the M2 and its place in history. The weapon had reshaped warfare, giving American forces a decisive advantage in firepower and range. Its .50 caliber rounds had proved effective against aircraft, light armor and fortifications, versatility that few weapons could match. He had seen its power firsthand, felt its recoil shake his bones, watched its tracers arc across hostile skies. He'd witnessed it save lives, his own included, and take lives. The weapon had been both shield and sword, defender and destroyer. It was a machine, Turner wrote carefully, his handwriting shaky with age. but it was the people who made it what it was. He explained how mechanics like Finch had kept the guns functioning under impossible conditions, how factory workers had sacrificed personal comfort to maintain production quotas, how gunners had trained until operating the weapon became instinctive, how engineers had refined the design based on battlefield feedback. The M2's success wasn't accidental. It was the product of American industrial capacity, technical expertise, and the determination of millions to see the war through to victory. The weapon was simply the most visible symbol of that collective effort. Turner sealed the letter and addressed it carefully. He hoped his grandson would understand that wars weren't won by weapons alone, but by the people who wielded them. That technology mattered, but courage, sacrifice, and dedication mattered more, and with that he signed off, knowing the M2 would always be a part of him, a part of them all, those who'd fought, those who'd built, those who'd survived. The weapon's story was their story, inseparable and enduring. The sun set outside his window, casting long shadows across the room. Turner closed his eyes, remembering, honoring the past while looking toward a future his generation had fought to secure.